And so this is where a lot of these African-American neighborhoods were being formed. Now, the history of Cincinnati includes a lot of race riots. Those black codes were a main part of why these riots came about. So this is a picture from the 1836 riots, but the one I'm going to really talk about is the 1829 riot. So in Cincinnati, in the 1820s, 1830s, the population again is booming. And there's an existing black community here. They're looking for those employment opportunities. They want to be in this area. And then you also have immigrants, European immigrants, mainly Irish immigrants, who are coming to this area looking for those same opportunities. And so it's kind of the same thing that we hear about all the time, competition for jobs and pitting, the poor classes against one another. And it comes to a head here. What ends up happening is that these Irish immigrants and white mobs, they started going into these black communities and they started burning businesses, burning homes, assaulting people. And that led to a mass exodus of the existing black community here. A lot of them went up to Canada. They formed a community up there. But you see a history of these race riots coming back and back. And the reason why the black codes were mainly to blame is because they kept saying that, well, they're not enforcing those fines, they're not enforcing all those restrictions upon this community. Out of these riots, you start seeing more and more organized black conventions, black rights conventions. You see them at the DC level, you see them in the state of Ohio. You're going to hear about a number of people on the tour who were involved in these movements. They're fighting the black codes, they're fighting the bonds to live in free states, they're fighting for abolition. And a lot of people say, well, okay, you talk about Ohio, yes, it was a free state. Well, the waterways, again, is why this becomes a center of Underground Railroad activity. So the Ohio River, it's separating us from two states, then Virginia, now West Virginia, and Kentucky, both slave-owning states. Ohio was traversed, and you can see all these lines and how they're indicating like this is a heavily traveled area. They're heading up to Canada. They're heading to Lake Erie, they're heading to Windsor and Detroit, they're heading to Niagara Falls. They're heading to Canada. Ohio was so heavily navigated because it was one of the easier ways to get to this sanctuary. And we hear a lot about white abolitionists. More and more we hear more about the black abolitionists and those who were helping, assisting, acting selflessly. But a lot of credit is also should be given to the indigenous peoples, the historic nations of Ohio and Indiana and Michigan, because they were early conductors and agents of the Underground Railroad. So there are a lot of cities and rivers and places named throughout Ohio to some of these historic tribes, the Shawnee, the Wyandotte or Wendat, as they call themselves historically, the Odawa, sometimes they get called Ottawa. So just want to kind of raise them up as well and hopefully share some more stories as we continue. And I want to share two stories with you that center here in Cincinnati about freedom seekers who were struggling to get to a place where their loved ones could live in freedom, live their lives to their fullest. First story that I'm going to tell you is the escape of the 28. So this happens in April of 1853. In Boone County, Kentucky, which is just right over the river and a little bit west of here, there was a group of 28 freedom seekers who on Easter night, they were able to coordinate together, and they were able to find 3 skiffs to take them across the river into Cincinnati. Well, it had been flooding recently. One of the skiffs sank, but they persevered. They were able to get up onto the banks of the Ohio River. They were able, they're muddy, they were wet. They were able to connect with some people here in Cincinnati, including a man named Levi Coffin. I'm going to talk about Levi Coffin a little bit more later. They were able to organize as kind of like this funeral procession. This was how they were going to navigate secret these individuals out of Cincinnati and towards freedom. They acted like a procession, and they were guiding them up to the northern part of the city. Unfortunately, the fake funeral turned out to be a real funeral. One of the women who was on the trip, she had brought her infant child. And all the conditions, traveling in April, it's cold, it's wet. The child succumbed to the elements, and they had to bury the child here in Cincinnati. The rest of the group, the 27, then made their way north. They got up to Canada. This was one of the largest groups to be freed from this area. It's very unusual to have a large group like this. So they found their freedom. I'm going to tell you another story from just a couple of years later, in January of 1856. And it's about Margret Garner and her family. Margaret was also from Boone County. Specifically, she was from an area called Ridgewood, Kentucky. It's about 16, 17 miles from here. And she was born on what was called the Maplewood Farm or Maplewood Plantation in Ridgefield. Her mother had been enslaved there. She was enslaved there. Her children would become enslaved there. Margaret was born of the situation that so many enslaved people had been born of. Her mother enslaved her father, her likely enslaver. And so this just speaks to the abuses that enslaved women faced in particular. When Margaret was about 14 or 15, she married another enslaved person. His name was Robert. He lived on an adjoining farm. And within a year, they welcomed their first son, a boy named Tom. And then they welcomed Sam and Mary and Scylla. But Sam, Mary, and Scylla were much lighter skinned. With Margaret working in the home, she too had been in close quarters with her white enslaver who sexually raped and assaulted her. And all of Margaret's children were born about 5 or 6 months after her enslaver, Archibald Gaines's own white children with his wife had been born. So when his wife was pregnant, that's when he would attack Margaret. And Robert, he being enslaved by somebody else, he was hired out quite a bit. He was hired out here to Cincinnati. He was hired out to other places in Kentucky. But when he'd come back, he would find his wife pregnant. And he likely knew that the child would not be his. And so this is not a quote from Robert, but I think it kind of sums up what a lot of men who had to go through this and see their wives, their mothers, their children be subjected to these abuses. He says to be a man and not to be a man. A father without authority, a husband and no protector is the darkest of fates. So Robert and Margaret, they come up with a plan. They want to get their family to freedom. Because yes, Margaret is experiencing these abuses, but as you'll hear a little bit more towards day 2, day 3 of this journey, Kentucky was known for literally selling people down the river. People were being born and raised up here, but then they were being sold down to the cotton fields. And they knew this was likely going to happen to their children. So to keep their families together, to preserve their families, they decided to travel north on the Underground Railroad. Now the Underground Railroad was well underway at this point. Ohio being so well traveled, we estimate about anywhere from 40 to 50,000 people successfully made it on the Underground Railroad through the state. That's out of about 100,000 nationwide. So Ohio, 40 to 50% just through here, just through Ohio. Now, traveling over the river could be dangerous. There would be patrols. So you couldn't just find a boat anywhere. You couldn't just find a bridge. So navigating the river could be difficult, especially at certain times of the year. One of the most popular times of the year was winter. And in January of 1856, the Ohio River froze. And so that's when Margaret and her family decided to navigate it. Now, who's traveling there? It's Robert, it's his wife Margaret, who is 22 and pregnant. 4 children with them in tow. And Robert's 2 parents, his mom and his dad. And so they make it to Cincinnati. They're looking for the home of a man named Elijah Kite, and it was a relation of Margaret's. Elijah welcomes them into his home, and he says, but we gotta get you out of here as quickly as possible. Elijah goes to the home of Levi Coffin. Levi Coffin was sometimes nicknamed the president of the Underground Railroad. He helped maybe as many as 3,000 freedom seekers navigate to freedom. So they said, let's get Levi involved, and we'll try to find a way to get you out of the city as quickly as possible. Elijah finds Coffin, but by the time he gets back home to try to get the family together and enact the plan, it's surrounded by U.S. Marshals as well as the enslaver. So this just kind of shows where those homes were located. And so the U.S. Marshals, the enslavers, Archibald Gaines, they surround the house. And Robert and Elijah, they try to fight off the Marshals. They try to keep the family secured. So it's the men in the front of the house, kind of boarding up the windows and the doors. Margaret and her mother-in-law take the 4 children to the rear of the home. But despite a very valiant effort, the Marshals, they break into the home and they start arresting the men. Margaret hears this, and she knows what the situation is. They're going to be caught. So rather than see her children taken back into slavery to suffer maybe the same abuses that she did, because she looks at her daughter, Mary, her 2-year-old daughter, who is considered beloved by her and very beautiful, she decides that it's better that they go to heaven rather than go back into slavery. And so she proceeds to take the lives of her children. She is successful in taking Mary's life. But Gaines, Archibald Gaines, and the U.S. Marshals, they break in before she's able to take the lives of her other children, take her own life. And so the family is then arrested. Now, the family is put in jail because there are questions as to ownership rights at this time, and they have to be tried under the Fugitive Slave Law. So this is really one of the only depictions of Margret Garner out there, and it is not an accurate one. The original painting is actually in this exhibit behind you over here, the From Slavery to Freedom exhibit. It was done about 10 years after these events, and it's problematic in its depiction of both Margaret and her children. It doesn't really convey, the fact that she attacked her daughter first and why she did that. And it also is called the modern Medea, which I think is very problematic because Medea in Greek mythology is made out to be a villain. She kills her child in spite of her husband who cheated on her, who abandoned her. Whereas here, she is doing this out of love and concern for her children. So Levi Coffin and others, they visit the family in jail. They have all these accounts of talking to Margaret, asking her why she did this, what can they do now? And this one from Coffin I think really sticks out the most. It says, "Those who came to speak words of comfort and cheer felt them die upon their lips when they looked into Margaret's face and Margaret's expression of settled despair. Her sorrow was beyond reach of any words of encouragement and consolation, and can only be realized in all its fullness, only by those who have tasted of a cup equally bitter." So they are provided with an attorney who is a very famous abolitionist attorney. His name is John Jolliffe, and Jolliffe is working to try to get the family tried in Ohio. He doesn't want them, one, tried in Kentucky, which had very harsh laws, and he also really does not want them tried under the fugitive slave law. And the fugitive slave law at this time basically said that the Garners, by freeing themselves, in the eyes of the law, they stole themselves. If a person assisted, like Elijah Kite, he could be tried as well for breaking this law. This is post-1850 when this law was enacted. He could go to jail for up to 6 months and or pay up to $1,000 fine. That's like $40,000 in today's money. That's more than what a lot of people make in a whole year. And so this law, if Jolliffe could convince that they be tried here in Ohio, even if they can't convince the judge that they are free being in the free state of Ohio, if you could convince them to try her for murder instead, which is what Margaret wanted, she gets tried as a person, not as property, and that would set a precedent. Eventually, Gaines convinces the commissioner to allow him to take Margaret and her children, and as well as Robert, his parents, back into Kentucky. And the agreement was that he'd be able to remand them back to Ohio when the murder charges were officially filed, and that the trial was able to proceed. So that was the agreement. He went back on his word, and he literally sold the family down the river. So Margaret, Robert, and the children were put on board a ship. They were originally sent to Arkansas to Gaines's brother, and then they were taken to New Orleans to be put on auction. And en route to New Orleans, they're on the Mississippi, and they're on a steamboat. The steamboat has a collision, and it's not this terrible crash, but Margaret goes overboard, and she takes her infant daughter with her. Margaret is rescued, the child is not. And so Margaret has now successfully saved another child from this fate. But they end up in New Orleans, where the family was purchased by an enslaver in Mississippi. And from there, after a couple of years, Margaret passes away from typhoid fever. And the reason that we know all this now is that her husband, Robert, was able to be tracked down a few years later in 1870. He was back here in Cincinnati. He was working on the river. He told reporters about how he had freed himself during the war, that he served in the Union Army, that when his wife was on her deathbed, she made him promise to never marry and never have any more children until the end of slavery. And he kept that promise to her. Shortly after he gave this report, he was in ill health himself when he passed away, and he's buried somewhere here in Cincinnati. So these are the stories that inspired Toni Morrison to write the book, Beloved. So I'm going to leave it with that for now. We'll continue on with the night, but my word of advice, as everybody has said, just be open, observe, reflect, question, and just be here for the journey. So thank you all very much.